Wow. So we see Muddy Waters has published a 28-page research report. And in the report, SoFi is a financial engineering treadmill, not a healthy growing origination business. SoFi shareholders are incessantly diluted so management can hit bonus targets through GE capital-style loan marks and Enron-esque off-balance sheet structures that disguise borrowings as revenue. And SoFi themselves have responded to these claims, though with nothing specific. And another analyst is shooting back at Muddy Waters, saying what they're alleging is not accurate. I mean, it's an analyst war. So I've done this same 24-hour challenge for both Robinhood and Klarna, so I thought it was going to be similar for SoFi, but man, this business is completely crazy right now. Alright, as always, we have 24 hours and we're starting on a brand new browser. We're going to be going to Investor Relations for SoFi. Once again, starting with the investor presentation, because I feel like that really shows what the company is trying to brag about and what they think retail should be looking at in order to come to a conclusion on the business. And as we can see, there's a vast array of products and services here that SoFi has to offer. I mean, really from everything from banking to cards to investing. I mean, they have everything that you would want within a bank. The goal of SoFi appears to be to bring consumers very deep within the ecosystem that makes it into a way that it's really hard to leave once you enter. And it looks like SoFi has something similar to Robinhood Gold with SoFi Plus. And yep, this is probably the main point that we want to gather here, that SoFi is really emphasizing the fact that they want to target younger consumers. They think that these are going to be people who are going to bring them higher LTVs, and this is going to grow their business much stronger into the long term. And it seems that the entire idea here is that we want to bring consumers in with maybe just a few products like loans, like student loans, which we once knew were a strong driving force in getting people to use SoFi. And then once people are integrated with one factor, then they're really sucked into the entire ecosystem, which allows for a profitable loop for SoFi. And it seems like that loop is really working. I mean, it's 41% increase in the amount of members that we're seeing on the platform. And it seems here that SoFi is trying to brag about being capital light, meaning that they're going to be needing less capital in order to service the same amount of revenues and deals. And it looks like we are moving more towards fee-based revenue. And we see that personal loan sales are selling consistently above what the fair market value appears to be. We see that we have a figure of 1.5 million for the total financial services segment, but we also see that this has grown from a much smaller 102 million in 2023 and then 248 million in 2024. And this is balanced out by the fact that in the lending segment, we've actually decreased how much we're relying on non-interest income in comparison to how much we're focusing on net interest income within these segments. And this is great to see for SoFi, because SoFi is actually a real bank. They're able to do funding on their own, meaning that they get to have deposit funding from people putting deposits in with SoFi, and then SoFi gets to loan those out. Most other fintechs aren't actually banks, meaning that this is a huge advantage for SoFi. And the guidance looks very strong for the business. I mean, the top line is still growing very strong, although deceleration, the growth is still very intense. And I would actually like to see what the sentiment on the market is for SoFi in general. Alright, so while doing a sentiment check, I came over here and saw that there was a short seller for SoFi, and I thought that was interesting enough, so I clicked upon that, and then I saw that we have a Muddy Waters short report. So I decided to do a little bit more searching into that, found this document, and finally we see this report talking about why they're shorting SoFi. And it seems to be a pretty serious allegation. SoFi is a financial engineering treadmill, not a healthily growing origination business. SoFi shareholders are incessantly diluted so management can hit bonus targets through GE capital-style loan marks and Enron-esque off-balance sheet structures that disguise borrowings as revenue. They're essentially saying SoFi is doing things that Enron were doing. I mean, this is no simple matter, and it's Muddy Waters Research. I mean, this is a real firm, real short sale firm that does not publish often. Okay, and then I found this document as well, SoFi 11 questions, 0 answers. So it seems to be going through each one of the questions that they're asking SoFi, everything that they went out to ask SoFi, and SoFi hasn't responded yet. I'm putting a timeline on screen on exactly what the events are, because there are a lot of events going on. There's a lot of back and forth here. And we're going to try to work through all this, because I mean, there are some insane accusations here, and any one of these accusations could really have strong implications against SoFi. So this is what SoFi said to respond to the short seller report, and Muddy Waters does make a point. SoFi did not say anything about any specific allegations. Pretty much everything is just them saying that this is not true and they intend to take legal action. But I don't know how much that's really worth, and the idea of how much Muddy Waters is really saying about SoFi. Alright, there's a lot of points made here, but I feel like there's a few main ones. First off, the idea that SoFi is avoiding charge-offs. Next, that they're using an adjusted default rate, which doesn't make sense, and that they're using an adjusted discount rate that doesn't make sense. The changes in the rating agency's assertions and what these mean for SoFi, and wet funding and seller financed loans, how management compensation ties into this, and just how exactly JP Morgan comes into all of this. First, what we must explore is the idea that there's possible avoidance of charge-offs. So we are introduced to this idea when SoFi supposedly disposing of defaulted loans within that charge-off threshold. So we see that there's a huge amount of loans sold to Altura Ventures LLC, $5 million, but this was $62.5 million of defaulted loans, but they weren't necessarily charged off. They were selling them for 8 cents on the dollar. Now, the problem here is that they could have been doing this sale before the loans were actually charged off, giving an artificially low charge-off number. While this is legal on its own, in the way that this is framed, it's possibly shady. But this is only when you use the lower number into the fair value model for actually showing what the loans are worth when you're estimating the future value of the loans. One problem that we're seeing is that we're having ranges of 6.6 to 13% across the last 8 quarters in terms of charge-offs, but they are using a figure that is 2 times lesser in order to calibrate their fair value model. These are the loans in which SoFi no longer owns, but they do service, so they have no reason to make these loans look stronger than they actually are, or to try and affect their charge-off rate. So this could show what the actual real underlying loans are going to be experiencing into the long term. Partial evidence that there's actually misinformation about these loans is that we're seeing charge-offs asymmetric to the amount of delinquencies. So you would expect to see delinquencies be X figure and then charge-offs to be lower than that X figure. And it's mathematically impossible for it to ever be higher than that because you only charge off as much as you're delinquent. Meaning that if you have a bunch of people who are late on loans, then only those people who are late on loans can end up costing the business money in the long term. But what we're actually seeing is that there's more being charged off than there is delinquent, which is mathematically impossible unless they're housing loans somewhere else where they're not being recognized as delinquent, but they are eventually being charged off. And this started with the delinquent loan sales program in Q1 2024. And we see that this is described as a value-enhancing capital optimization strategy, but in reality, it seems like it's possible that they're using this to just offload loans, to thus give them a lower charge-off rate than is actually being experienced. So thus, the accusation is that the loans are going bad, you sell them very cheap, and then the loans just get off the books. So the idea that we have to move to is what actually is the idea that we can be using for the default rate. And while Muddy Waters is citing a 6.1% charge-off and there's a 2.89% reported, we have to understand what actually could be the charge-off rate. Now, the 2.89%, that's of the loans that SoFi is actually holding. So of the loans SoFi is holding, we have 2.89% in charge-offs, and even SoFi cites that they're using around a 4.5% charge-off for the loans that they're using for the loans that they're actually originating. But Muddy Waters still cites a higher charge-off rate at 6.1%. I argue that this figure is closer to 5% than that 4.5% that we're citing, because the rating agencies are actually putting the annualized charge-offs to be around 4.7% to 5.1% depending on the source. The problem here is if you use any other figure that is lower than that to define how much you're actually going to be losing on the loans, then you're going to be getting an inflated figure for the actual value of the loans, resulting in incomes and recognitions that just aren't present within the business. Also, another figure to recognize is that Fitch has revised its assumptions upward every trust it's reviewed. That means every single time that they've reviewed the loan offerings of SoFi, they've increased the amount that they think that the loans are going to be charging off. and this exact figure is 68% in the last 3 years. The problem with this is that SoFi is just not hitting on those charge-off rates that the rating agencies are expecting them to be hitting on. This does signify, in addition to the other things we already talked about, that there could be material weakness within the underwriting system of SoFi. Now, the next point Muddy Waters makes is the discount rate that SoFi is using for their loans. We see that they're using a 3.89% discount rate to price in the risk of the student loans that they're originating. And then Muddy Waters is saying this doesn't make sense because compared to the 10-year US Treasury, which is around 4.3% during the same period, this is below the risk-free rate, essentially saying that SoFi's loans are safer than government loans, which is not true. But this is the first point in which I actually disagree with Muddy Waters because they're using a figure of 11.4 years in order to get to how long SoFi's loans actually are. And they did this by reverse engineering the maturity schedule. So here we see the loan maturity schedule, and when you do all the math, you actually do get that 11.4 figure for the maturity. But the reason why I actually don't agree with using the maturity schedule is because there's going to be things like repayment, there's going to be things like amortization, there's going to be so many factors that come into play that affect how long the loan actually is. And this is actually what SoFi is saying, is that that's how long loans are actually going to last, is around that 4-year mark. So when we're using 4 years, it makes much more sense to use the figures that SoFi is using. So from Mizuho, we actually see that the average length of the loan, being argued 4 years, is actually not exactly accurate either. And the reason for this is because SoFi created their model for evaluating how long loans actually are in around 2020 to 2022. This was at a time when rates were super low, so people wanted to refinance and people wanted to pay their current loans off early. But now, today, in the current environment, rates are much higher. There's no reason to go out and refinance your loan right now in a higher environment. So maybe, while maturity doesn't make total sense, this 4-year figure doesn't make entire sense either. But this is where the true problem is that even if SoFi's figures, once again, are even approximately wrong, then they're making up fake gains. Muddy Waters is now alleging that the loan platform business is not a capital light toll booth. What they're alleging instead is that it's wet funded and it's a forward flow agreement. Now, what does this mean? It means that SoFi is selling loans off to other businesses, but also lending them the money for the businesses to buy the loans. So essentially, SoFi still takes on the risk of the loans while also not getting the full benefit of having the loans. So why would you do this? Muddy Waters later allegates that this is to hit compensation figures for management, but we'll get more into that as well. Now, the main indication of this happening is the fact that it has actually happened. We see with Carlyle, this has actually happened before when they only provided 4.5% of the funding for the loans that were purchased, meaning that SoFi actually funded 90% of their own loan purchases, and then the rest of the 5% was funded by unknown parties. But this can be said that this is actually going to be happening with other loan sales. Now, we're given even more evidence that this is a sketchy transaction when we're looking at the fact that every single time SoFi is doing a loan sale to any one of the partners that they've recently sold to, they're always passing them off to Cantor Fitzgerald first, and then the same day they're sold. So Cantor is really just being a middleman here, just sending the loans over to these other trusts. So why is Cantor needed at all? Why can't SoFi just sell the loans directly to any one of these companies? So the question ultimately is whether SoFi is funding these loans themselves or whether the businesses are actually buying them. And if SoFi is funding every single one of these loans, then where is the value that SoFi is actually to be finding from these loans? Because they're actually subtracting how much value they can extract while also taking on the same amount of risk. They're not getting the incomes generated from the loans, but they are selling them and then just getting a smaller amount of income right now. And then the question that goes along with that is, can you really call a loan sale in which you fund 80 to 90% of the sale a loan sale? Another problem that we're seeing is that the business itself actually alleged that they do not retain any of the credit risk after the transfer. So we know at one point they definitely were retaining the credit risk when they were selling off to Carlyle. But are they retaining credit risk with all these other transactions? How true is this? Now, the last figure that I want to bring up is the fact that 312 million of secured loans seem to be pledged for a refinancing and not sold. And this is through JP Morgan. So what exactly does this mean? It means JP Morgan is actually acting like SoFi owns the loans when SoFi is saying that these 312 million in loans have been sold off. JP Morgan would not have made this loan if they were using collateral in which SoFi doesn't even own. It just does not make sense. It wouldn't be the case. Now, why exactly did this happen? It's because the SEC sent a comment letter on the situation in which SoFi's senior secured loans were increasing at an extreme rate, as we can see. And now we're having a huge decrease in the amount of senior secured loans due to the offloading of these loans in different instruments, such as this 312 sold, apparently. But JP Morgan seems to think that they haven't sold these loans and that they still actually have them on the books, even though SoFi is saying that they did sell these loans. Now, also the problem that we're seeing is that SoFi introduced these loans as senior secured loans, which they eventually cut down to just secured loans. The reason for this is because JP Morgan actually became the senior position for the loans, while SoFi was just cut down to mezzanine or junior. So this means that JP Morgan is taking on less risk for SoFi's loans than SoFi is. And this is because SoFi is borrowing against those loans that they're saying that they sold in the first place. The final point I want to bring is the idea of management compensation. So this is the fuel to the fire that Muddy Waters is saying is causing all this fraudulent work. But the problem is, Noto hasn't sold any of his SoFi shares. And while this is true, he has borrowed heavily against them. But while he hasn't actually sold any shares, he's used an instrument called a prepaid variable forward. And while this means that the loans haven't actually been sold, the bank is giving you money to borrow against them, so you actually have monetized the shares. So technically, while the shares could crash to zero, and Noto would still keep the tens of millions in which he borrowed against the loans, it still would be an extreme risk. He would only have the cash, which represents 80 to 90% of the portfolio's value. Now, there's a bunch of other distinctions of exactly how these prepaid variable contracts work. But essentially, Muddy Waters is saying Noto has the money now, so he has everything to gain. But what doesn't make sense to me is Noto is an extremely successful entrepreneur who's had positions at many firms such as the NFL, Goldman Sachs, and Twitter. I mean, it just doesn't make sense for him to move into SoFi and then just start committing fraud. The only idea that I could have against this is if SoFi seems to have no way out and it seems like it's going to be certainly a failure, then if Noto has had a life of winning, he would not want to be reduced to this one loss. Though overall, it just doesn't make sense to me that Noto would have such a concentrated amount of risk within SoFi and then still be willing to buy shares. Now, buying shares in and of itself mean really nothing to me because, of course, everyone would buy shares to ease the fear of the market in light of a short sale report when you have 58 million in which you have received in cash. But by buying, you also are not allowed to sell any of your shares for 6 months. Just overall, it just doesn't make sense to me that Noto would want to use SoFi as an instrument purely for his own profit. But one last thing I want to review is, why was SoFi's defense so lackluster? I mean, there was nothing. If there really was a defense against everything that's happening, everything that's being alleged, then I feel like they would have said something about it to ease investor concerns. We're going to have to see in the next earnings whether or not they're actually going to detail everything that's been happening. I imagine that the earnings call is going to be quite an intense showcasing of what's happening. But overall, the lack of any defense seems kind of shady. And then Mizuho, they only addressed 3 of the concerns in which Muddy Waters brought to light. This is actually something Muddy Waters even detailed could happen. Often companies are going to be met with a bunch of concerns for the business and then answer a whole bunch of other concerns. And while there weren't a whole bunch of other concerns being detailed, there were only a fraction of the ones that needed to be detailed actually explained. Now, the problem that I have with SoFi at this point is that there's so much weighing on this short seller report, meaning that essentially the price is going to be dictated upon whether the short sale report is correct or if it's incorrect. And that's just something that I don't want to have happen long term. But with this much unclarity, this much uncertainty, and the fact that SoFi is just unable to answer any of the questions at this time, I have to sell because of these reasons.